αυτό, είχα το τυφάκι τα σκυλία και εκείνη η ώρα. Έρχομαι εδώ πάνω, βλέπω ένα βοή. Η βοή που βγαίνει η βοή, κατεβαίνω εδώ κοντά, βλέπω ένα πλάκα, ένα πάνω.
In September of 1960, at the insistence of an old Greek shepherd called Uncle Philippos, a small group of men began to dig a hole in a hillside in northern Greece. The men came from the Greek village of Petrolona, about 30 miles from Thessalonica. For a number of years, the village had been desperately short of water. Uncle Philippos had discovered a crevice from which came the noise of what he thought was an underground stream. It was fresh water that they were after. When they eventually broke through, they found themselves in a long, narrow underground chamber. They came back later with lamps to explore it. They didn't know it at the time, but they were about to add another page to the long story of mankind. There was a whole series of linked caves stretching far under the hillside. The men kept going until they were almost half a mile from the entrance. They never found an underground stream. The noise that Uncle Philippos had heard was simply air flowing through these great caverns. What they did find was quite unexpected, and at first it terrified them. It was the skull of an early human ancestor. Since that discovery 20 years ago, the vast, beautiful Petrolona cave has yielded a large number of fossil animal bones and stone tools, but only that one single human skull. It's important because it shows us that around 500,000 years ago, a significant transition had begun to take place, one that eventually was to lead to fully modern people, to us, Homo sapiens sapiens. Fully modern man is widespread and well known from about 40,000 years ago. Where did these people come from? What was their point of origin? Was it a single source, or could they have been widespread in a more ancestral stage? The skull here at Petrolona is important because it does give us some crucial information. The skull is, in a sense, intermediate between modern man and the more primitive Homo erectuses that are known from Africa, from Asia, and from the Far East. I believe we should think of Erectus not so much as a true species, but as a stage in the evolution of ourselves. I believe Homo erectus spread into areas like the warmer parts of southern Europe, spread out across Africa, and indeed spread right across Asia and the Far East. I think it is from these erectus populations that you get your transition into what we consider to be modern man. And the Petrolona skull is perhaps the most complete and best example we have at this time. The Petrolona skull marks the beginning, in Europe, of an accelerated period of human evolution. We find the same thing in Africa and Asia, populations that from about 400,000 years ago onwards bridge the gap between Homo erectus and ourselves. As a group, they've been called archaic Homo sapiens. They retain the heavy faces and brow ridges of earlier forms, but their brain size is increasing and begins to approach that of modern peoples. We're not sure why this brain growth should have happened when it did. but it is clear that the long period of stability we saw with erectus is over. There's now rather rapid development. A development that continues until around 100,000 years ago, when we arrive at one of the best known of all our ancestors, yet also one of the most misunderstood. In 1856, some quarry workers were digging on the opposite side of this pretty German valley near Düsseldorf, and they were removing sediment from a cave that was about 60 feet higher than where we are now. As the sediment was thrown down onto the valley floor, they noticed that there were some bones in the sediment. The bones were shown to a local German scientist, Professor Johann Karl Fulrott. He was also an anatomist, and he quickly recognized that these weren't the bones of modern man. The skull he saw was large, it was wide, it was long, it was also very thick. The brow ridges were prominent and protruding, and amongst the limb bones there was clear evidence of a very massive individual. The thigh bones themselves showed a slight curvature or bowing. Fulrott concluded that these bones were from a barbarous and savage race, but significantly, he also noted that they were the most ancient memorial to Europe's early inhabitants. This latest idea wasn't at all popular at the time. Others preferred a much more picturesque idea, that these were the bones of a Mongolian Cossack, a soldier who had died here during the Napoleonic Wars of 1814. A soldier, by the way, who had had rickets. The bones found in this valley were the subject of much controversy for many years. They have come to symbolize, wrongly as it happens, all that is brutish, primitive, and simple about our past. They were found here in the valley of Neanderthal in German, and of course, the bones are the original Neanderthal man. Misconceptions about Neanderthal man abound. This early film shows them threatened by dinosaurs, which became extinct at least 70 million years before man arrived on the scene. Neanderthal is shown as a stupid, savage creature, a view that's still very common. It's assumed that their dim brains are no match for the superior mental prowess of fully modern man. Even by 1929, when these models were made, Neanderthal people are still portrayed as shambling dimwits with slumped shoulders and a pronounced stoop. So where did this unflattering image come from? This is the culprit, a Neanderthal specimen from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in the French Dordogne. It was discovered in 1908. At that time, very few earlier ancestral humans had been found, so it's perhaps not surprising that they expected to find primitive features in this skeleton. It was studied initially by the influential French anatomist Marcellin Boule. It was Boule who concluded that Neanderthal had rounded shoulders, a curved spine, and walked like an ape. It was a travesty of the truth. What Boule failed to take into account was that this specimen was diseased. It was an old man who had suffered severe arthritis, and this accounted for many of the skeleton's features, like the curve of the spine, the compression of the vertebrae, and the condition of the knee joints and legs. Boule also dismissed the brain of La Chapelle as purely vegetative or bestial, despite the fact that it was actually larger than that of many modern humans. When these errors are corrected, the result is quite a different picture from the shambling brute of popular imagination. Instead, we have someone who, it's been suggested, would, if dressed in modern clothes, probably pass unnoticed in any New York subway. However, Neanderthals were undoubtedly shorter, stockier, and much more muscular than we are today. The appearance itself has been the subject of considerable discussion over a very long time indeed. All sorts of ideas have been put forward as to the exact significance of these characteristics. One of the more popular ideas was that the ruggedness was related directly to an adaptation to the extreme cold that Neanderthal existed in. An alternative view, and one which is surely more traditional, but probably also wrong, is that the features of Neanderthal are primitive and that they're consistent with a stage of evolution immediately preceding modern man. I think Neanderthal is modern man, and I think the features that we see in the Western European examples are merely racial features or regional variants on the theme of modern man. I see Neanderthal as developing quite naturally from Homo erectus that also lived in Europe in earlier periods. In any event, Neanderthal was extremely successful. Neanderthal thrived in the Ice Age conditions of Western Europe. For hundreds of thousands of years, the northern hemisphere was gripped by severe cold as ice sheets periodically expanded and spread from higher ground. These were the Ice Ages. Yet interspersed with these were long, warmer periods, warmer in fact than today. Then, pine forest and woodland flourished across much of Europe, and it was during one of these warmer periods that Neanderthals had first appeared, around 100,000 years ago, probably living in areas that looked quite like this. The humans that preceded Neanderthals had retreated south as the ice advanced. Neanderthals, however, were the first humans to meet the challenge of increasing cold. As the climate got colder, around 70,000 years ago, they remained in the northern regions, which must have become very like present-day tundra. It was a bleak environment, but with their tough physique, their use of fire, their hunting skills, and greater intelligence, Neanderthals were able to survive in these harsh conditions. Because Neanderthals were first found in Europe by Europeans, it was assumed that this important stage in human evolution only happened in this part of the world. Yet Neanderthal remains are now known not only throughout Europe, but also in the Near East and beyond. So I think we must get away from the Eurocentric view when trying to see where Neanderthal fits in the story of our species. A remarkably large number of so-called Neanderthal specimens have now been found. But even though there are these good numbers, undoubtedly Neanderthal, as we know him, represents a relatively small part of the world's population at any one time, perhaps less than 15%. What is intriguing is really the difference between the Neanderthals, those that definitely came before them, the Homo erectus populations, and ourselves. All of Neanderthal must be descended from Homo erectus. The major difference is simply a difference in architecture in the skull. If you take a typical Homo erectus, such as this specimen from Africa, and you compare it to somebody such as ourselves, a modern skull, it's very easy to see that the major differences are in the proportions of the face. In erectus, it's long and wide. In the size of the brain area, in modern man, it's much larger than in erectus. And in erectus, it has these very prominent brow ridges that project out forwards. The specimens that come between the so-called Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East show characteristics that are, if you like, transitional between the two. In Europe, this transition occurred somewhere between the last erectuses, 200,000 years, and the first fully sapient forms at about 40,000 years. This same transition we now know was happening elsewhere. It was happening in the Middle East, it was happening in Asia, and it was happening in Africa. And when you look at one of the transitional forms, such as a Neanderthal, you will see that it's still got prominent brow ridges and still a relatively long and wide face. But the expansion of the brain has already occurred. In fact, some of the European Neanderthals have these huge brains, almost larger than the average modern person. If you go into Africa, you see the same sort of situation. You see this transition. So Neanderthal is simply the name we give to one particular, largely European, representative of a stage in mankind that everywhere preceded fully modern people. With Neanderthal, the pace of technological change begins to quicken. The way they worked stone was an improvement on earlier techniques. Dr. Mark Newcomer has studied and replicated their methods. The Neanderthals made a carefully shaped core and then chipped one end until they had a flat surface. Then, a single well-delivered blow to this surface broke off a large flake of predetermined size and shape. They took these flakes and turned them into a variety of different tools. This was one common form, a serrated edge useful for sawing thick hides, meat or bone. They made chisels, borers, saws, knives, to create a varied toolkit. These may just be different tools for different uses, but they could also represent different cultural traditions among separate groups of Neanderthals. I think one of the important things about such tools is that they clearly took care and deliberation to make. An appreciation of shape and material was needed. They remind us again that we're not dealing with a brutish, clumsy caveman, but with an intelligent and skillful human being. If we want insights into the way Neanderthal thought, then these tools give us some clues. But we do have one other extraordinary piece of evidence. These are the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in Iraq. This film was taken by Professor Ralph Selecki during the archaeological expeditions that he led there in the 50s. The local Kurdish tribesmen took Selecki and his team to a huge cave in the mountains. It's called Shanidar. Numerous stone tools, typical of the Neanderthal tradition, had been found there. Selecki began his excavations. They were to lead to one of the most remarkable of all Neanderthal discoveries, something that still strikes a chord across 60,000 years and firmly links the mind of Neanderthal with our own. They first found remains of 3 Neanderthals that had been killed and buried when part of the cave had collapsed. But the 4th Neanderthal was different. He had been carefully laid in a shallow grave, and when earth from this grave was later analyzed, it was found to contain dense clusters of pollen, a discovery that allowed the investigators to reconstruct what the Neanderthals were doing on a summer's day in the Shanidar cave some 60,000 years ago. This had been a ceremonial burial. The pollen reveals that the dead Neanderthal had been placed on a bed of pine branches, that his companions had then gathered flowers to scatter on his body. It might almost be seen as a religious ceremony. Surely these people did this because they had a reverence for the dead, perhaps even a belief in an afterlife. Neanderthals are the first humans known to have buried their dead with ritual. They emerge from prehistory as a people with a recognizably human range of beliefs and a capacity for abstract thought. Yet, despite their intelligence and skills, Neanderthals were to disappear. What happened to them? It's one of the great puzzles of prehistory. Are we descended from Neanderthal man or not? This is Mount Carmel, a range of hills outside Haifa in Israel. From here come some of the best clues we have to the puzzle of Neanderthal's fate. The hills are dotted with around 24 caves, and in some of them remains have been found of the people who lived here over a period of about 150,000 years, both before and during the last ice age. This cave, 70,000 years ago, was the home of Neanderthal. They may have lived here for some considerable time.
I'm now in the Tabun cave, or the Cave of the Oven. This was excavated first in the 1930s. In the 30s, they found the best parts of a skeleton and a second fragmented skull. The skull came from just above where my head is. This skull was of a classic Neanderthal type, and is known now as the Tabun skull.
With this discovery, there could be no doubt that an unmistakable Neanderthal group, very similar to those in Europe, was living in one part of the Carmel Range. Yet further along the hillside, not more than a couple of 100 yards away from Tabun, there is another small cave. It's called Skul, the Cave of the Goat. This is probably a more recent site. People lived here around 40,000 years ago. 10 skeletons were found here in the 1930s. They were buried on the terrace in front of the cave, and the individuals found here at Skul are quite different from those found at Tabun. Unlike the classic Neanderthals, they have only small brow ridges and a high forehead. They aren't fully modern, but they do look much more like us.
There are two basic ways of interpreting the later stages of human evolution. Both of these are perhaps rather extreme. One of them has Neanderthal evolving gradually through an intermediate phase into fully modern man. If you take a classic Neanderthal skull, such as this one from Tabun, it's thought that it evolved to a stage like this from Skul, and from this into fully modern man.
To get from a classic Neanderthal skull to modern man, the architecture of the face and brain case has to change quite dramatically. It's argued that the frontal lobes of the brain enlarged, leading to a more rounded brain case and the tucking in of the face. The result would be something very like the fossils from Skul, a kind of missing link, a group caught in the act of evolving from Neanderthal to modern people. The evolutionary process continued. The brain case got larger, the face shorter. Now the skull is identical to those of the first fully modern people of 40,000 years ago, and almost identical to our own skulls. By this argument, Neanderthal didn't become extinct. They evolved into us.
The other completely different way of understanding Neanderthal is that they were dead ends, that they didn't evolve into anything at all, and that the specimens we now know from the Middle East and from Western Europe represent a race or a population that was confined to this area and that was later replaced by different humans, a perhaps more modern type of human that came in from elsewhere. One of the most extreme or radical interpretations is that the more modern humans had more successful technology and actually wiped out the Neanderthal populations.
So what did happen? There's recently been some new evidence to show that here in Europe, Neanderthals weren't suddenly replaced, but lived alongside more modern people for some 10,000 years. So there could have been some interbreeding. Neanderthal genes could be in all of us. Eventually, though, only the more modern types remained, and their fossils were first found here in the valleys of the Dordogne in France. The first skull turned up in the village of Les Aisies in 1868, beneath what is now the Cro-Magnon Hotel. It marked the arrival in Europe of our species. Cro-Magnon is around 40,000 years old. It has the large brain and small face of all modern humans. It's undoubtedly Homo sapiens sapiens.
The fact that the first fossils of fully modern Homo sapiens were found here in Europe led many people to believe that fully modern man was a European development. This is another example of a Eurocentric bias. We now know that modern man evolved much earlier elsewhere. We have examples of Homo sapiens in Africa and in Asia at almost 100,000 years old. I think one has to look at the European population of Cro-Magnon simply as an example of just that, a European population of Homo sapiens.
With these early direct ancestors came another advance in technology. In Europe, the stone tools were finer and more varied than ever before. Beginning with long, thin blades, they shaped the stone into knives, borers, scrapers, some only a few inches long, and all of them delicately worked. For 2 million years, our ancestors had worked stone to provide the tools they needed. This was the beginning of the final phase of that stone tool technology, before the revolution created by the advent of metallurgy. Increasingly, these Ice Age people began to use the stone tools to work other materials. Tools of bone and antler appear for the first time. Implements like these bone needles, used perhaps for sewing hides and skins to make clothing or tents. And reindeer antlers to make awls and harpoons. Hundreds of these artifacts have been found in the living sites of the people of the last Ice Age.
In southern France and in Spain, they tended to live in either cave mouths or rock shelters, like this one, overlooking a river, in a valley, and the caves themselves, or the shelters, often faced southwards. This gave the added advantage of having more sunshine, particularly important in these conditions, when temperatures seldom rose above 55 in the summer, and probably in winter never rose above freezing. Looking out from a rock shelter such as this, prehistoric man would have seen a totally different environment from that which we see today.
The Ice Age climate created a wide variety of different habitats that supported the widest range of animals ever found together in one area of Europe. Some of them came from the colder north, like the muskox, the reindeer migrating through the valleys, and the woolly mammoth. There were animals of the plains like bison and wild horses. The forests of the region were inhabited by deer and bears, stags and wild boar. There were carnivores like the wolves that still inhabit Europe today, and animals that have long since vanished from there, like leopards and lions. It was rich hunting territory. Nothing like it has been seen since. We know these animals were important to man, not just because their bones are found on the early living sites, but because for the first time we have a quite remarkable new kind of evidence.
In 1879, a cave was discovered in Spain at a place called Altamira. In it, there were hundreds of cave paintings of bison, of horses, of deer, and of other animals. The people who discovered this cave put forward the idea that these paintings were the work of primitive man, prehistoric man, perhaps dating back thousands of years. The scientific establishment of the day totally rejected this notion. How could primitive man have done such fine paintings, was the question.
Opposition to the very idea of prehistoric art was powerful and vehement. And then an important discovery was made at this cave in the French village of La Moute. It was found in 1895, 16 years after Altamira. The original entrance had been totally blocked by rubble containing stone tools, undoubtedly made by Ice Age people. The rubble had not been disturbed, so when investigators broke through, they knew that they were the first people to enter the cave in 25,000 years. And that meant that anything they found had to have been here at least that long. And what they found were these, engravings of animals. They're now very faint, but this is still recognizable as a bison. Just above it is a mammoth. In all, some 30 engravings have been found here, the first cave art ever found in France, and the incontrovertible proof that the artist was prehistoric man. Prehistoric art has since been found not only in Europe, but in Asia and in Africa. It largely depicts the animals that were so crucial in the hunting societies of that time. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. In many of these carvings, we can see a fine workmanship and an attention to detail that reveals great intelligence, skill, and precise observation. Take, for example, this carving of a bison licking its flank, something that bison do to get rid of the irritating flies that swarm around them in summer. It's an almost photographic reproduction of what actually happens in real life. The realism of the animal engravings contrasts vividly with the symbolic approach of these carvings, the so-called Venuses. Only a few inches tall, they're found right across Europe and into Russia and Siberia. It's been suggested that these statuettes, with their exaggerated buttocks and stomachs and breasts, are fertility symbols or images of mother gods. The Venuses are not, however, typical of the way early artists depicted the human form. Equally common are the engravings and carvings of great realism. The most remarkable of all were found in the French cave of La Marche. These engravings are some 15,000 years old. We are looking at the first portraits ever of our distant ancestors. They look like the sort of people you'd expect to see in any French cafe today. But did they think in the same way as we do? What was going on inside their heads? Why did they create their art? Alexander Marshak has spent the last 15 years in some quite unique research. He's done what nobody thought of doing before. He studied the artifacts through a microscope. He found clues to when and why our species evolved the capacity for dealing with abstract symbols, for creating art, something no other animal on Earth can do. Marshak is not an orthodox prehistorian. He began as a journalist, writing a book for NASA on the exploration of space. He wanted to trace to its very beginnings man's technological and scientific expertise. And his first clue came from a piece of carved bone 30,000 years old. Until Marshak studied it, it had been described as having a purely abstract decoration.
When I put this under the microscope, I was absolutely staggered, because what you had was not random marking or decoration, but a very intentional marking where somebody made 4 marks with one tool in one style, then with a different tool made another 2 or 3 marks, then with a different tool another set of marks. And 69 marks were marked on the face of this little tool with 29 different changes of style and tool. And as I studied it, I saw that not only was it intentional accumulation of sets of marks, but an image was created with these marks, and that the image was a serpentine image that began in the center, turned around again, turned around once again, turned around again, and turned around again, and that this was not a random pocking, but an intentional notation of some kind. Somebody was keeping some sort of record. And since this is 25,000 years before the beginning of writing, before the beginning of arithmetic, the question was, what on earth could a man at that period have been doing? Since it was an accumulation over a period of time, maybe it had some reference to the passage of time. And so I took the notation as it was made and laid it against the actual phases of the moon, beginning from the first crescent, the day of no moon, first crescent, and then as it waxes to full moon, back to half moon, and back to crescent. And when I laid this notation against the actual processes of the moon, it was a perfect fit.
Marshak noted that the different marks seemed to be grouped in sequences of 7, suggesting the period between a half and a full moon. Plotting this sequence against the baton, the pattern begins with no moon visible, the black dot. The moon rises to half moon, to full moon 7 days later, then wanes back to half moon, and no moon again, 1 lunar month. The pattern then repeats itself, and it may also correspond to the observer's view of the moon's changing position in the night sky.
And here you had a 2.5 month notation, which could very, very easily be from the high point of the sun in the summer to the first frost in the fall, or from the first snowfall to the thaw, a period of 2.5 or 3 months, which means all the hunter had to do was to count 2 or 3 moons, and he was in a clearly distinct other season with a different way of life. And it seemed as though this man were making an image of the waxing and waning of the moon 30,000 years ago, 25,000 years before astronomy, the invention of writing and arithmetic, and it shouldn't have been there. And from that point on, looking at all the material in Europe, all the incised material in Europe, I found that the symbol systems, the things they were doing, indicated a complexity of thought and a complexity of culture that had never been discussed before. And this is 10, 20, 30,000 years before agriculture. An extraordinary intellectual achievement.
Marshak then turned his attention to some of the engraved artifacts depicting animals and plants. Once again, his microscopic studies showed there was more to them than met the eye. He believes that they tell a kind of story. They're a sort of hunter's guide to the seasons.
On this baton at the end of the Ice Age, you have an incredibly beautiful, complex composition which is an illustration of what's happening in the season. For instance, you have here a bull seal and a cow seal. The bull collects his harem in the springtime. In front is a male salmon with a hook on its jaw. The salmon come upriver in France after the thaw in the springtime, and it's only the male that develops this hook on the jaw in the mating time when it comes upriver. As it comes upriver, the hook begins to develop. So here you have a bull seal and a cow seal in the springtime, and the image of a salmon coming upriver in the springtime. The baton was found 100 miles inland upriver from the coast. The seals came upriver chasing the salmon. All the other images are representations of the springtime. You have here the beautiful image of three plants in full leaf. You have here a very, very tiny seedling, a sprout coming up out of the soil with roots and first leaves. You have here a flower in full bloom. You have on the other face two male serpents at the time of mating with their phallus indicated here on the image. Every image on the baton is an image of early spring after the thaw, with all the creatures coming from different realms. This kind of composition, which is the end of the Ice Age, gives us a clue as to the rituals that might have occurred in the caves, which might also have been seasonal. And all of the engraved art that I have examined, the complex compositions of this type, are almost always seasonal. And when the art begins to appear in the record, the art is not so much aesthetic expression as it is a hunter marking and making images of what is significant in his life, in his territory, in his rituals. And it's these skills that made him a better hunter, which also made him an artist at the end, because what he was depicting was his life, his territory, his animals, his rituals, all of which made him a hunter in a complex culture. It was not tool making, but the whole complex of capacities that was evolving in the brain at the same time. We find the tools at the beginning. We find the art at the end. But it's all one evolution of one general capacity.
The more we learn about these prehistoric artists, the more we realize how remarkably like us they were. There's no question that their art depicts their physical world, but it goes even further. And one finds very good examples of art form that depicts ritual, depicts ceremony. Of all the French painted caves, there's probably none more dramatic than the famous cave of Lascaux. Lascaux has been closed to the public for almost 20 years. This was to be the very first time since then that film cameras were allowed inside.
Bonjour.
I was shown in by Monsieur Massal, who, as a young boy of 8, had first discovered the cave by accident almost 40 years ago. That discovery revealed some of the greatest works of art of all time. Our ancestors painted these staggering images some 17,000 years ago. Using pigments made from manganese and ochre, and painting with fingers or brushes made probably from twigs, they depicted with great vitality the animals that they saw all around them.
Perhaps the finest of all Lascaux paintings are found in a narrow corridor running off from the main cave. It's been called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory, and it may indeed have been the center for some ritual or religious ceremony. So precious are these paintings that Lascaux can never again be opened to large numbers of people. So the French are building nearby an exact replica of the cave in order that more people can see and wonder at this remarkable achievement of our ancestors.
Probably one of the most frustrating things about prehistoric art is that we'll never know precisely why it was done. Why did people come into these caves and draw and paint these magnificent animals on the walls? Certainly the animals were important to the artists and the communities that the artists came from. These people were hunter-gatherers and had lived for hundreds of thousands of years on these animals. Interestingly, it was shortly after this cave was painted that the habit of painting caves virtually ceased. Curiously, too, it was about this time that this way of life, the way of life of the hunter-gatherers, gradually gave way to a new way of life. A completely new era in the human story was about to begin.